Today we're going to look at the Irish Troubles, specifically looking at what happened between the years of 1900 and 2000. Make sure to leave a like rating on this video and we'll go ahead and get started. Reviewed and edited by Dr. Stephen F. Myler, PhD. We begin in 1900 with the Home Rule movement, which sought to win legislative autonomy or Home Rule for Ireland within the United Kingdom. At the time, Ireland was still part of the United Kingdom and was governed directly by Westminster. For most of the 19th century, most Irish political parties had focused on getting full independence from the UK, but after several failed rebellions and with growing support for the idea of a federal UK, more moderate Irish nationalists began to campaign for Home Rule. And as a result, by the early 20th century, the most popular demand among Irish nationalists was for an autonomous Irish Parliament with legislative control over most domestic affairs. In 1912, the Liberal government of the UK introduced a Home Rule Bill for Ireland. The bill would have established Home Rule for all of Ireland except for the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which would remain under direct British rule. In response, the Northern Unionists signed the Ulster Covenant, promising to resist any threat to the union of Northern Ireland with the rest of the United Kingdom. The Ulster Unionist Council also formed the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, a paramilitary force tasked with preventing the implementation of Home Rule. As a result, the British government considered deploying army force to occupy Ulster. The resulting controversy over whether the army should be deployed led to the First World War and delayed the issue of Home Rule for nearly a decade. But when the war was over, the issue of Home Rule was once again brought to the forefront of Irish politics, and in 1916, a group of Irish Republicans seized buildings in Dublin and raised the Irish flag over the post offices in what became known as the Easter Rising. Led by the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army, the rebels held out for 6 days before being crushed by British force. However, the Rising was a galvanizing moment for Irish nationalists and contributed to growing support for full independence rather than Home Rule. And so it was that following the Easter Rising of 1916 that the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, was formed with the goal of achieving full independence for Ireland. Then came the Anglo-Irish War of 1919 to 1921. When the First World War ended, Ireland was still under British rule. But thanks in large part to the efforts of the IRA, who waged a brutal guerrilla war against the British using hit-and-run tactics that included ambushes, raids and assassinations, the British were unable to maintain control of the country. On July 11, 1921, after more than 2 years of fighting and with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory, both sides agreed to a ceasefire. On December 6, 1921, the British and the Irish leaders met in London to sign the Treaty of Anglo-Irish Treaty, which officially ended the Anglo-Irish War. The treaty partitioned Ireland into 2 separate states, Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State, 6 counties in the northeast of Ireland, with a majority Protestant population, were allowed to remain part of the UK, while the rest of Ireland was granted full independence and became the Irish Free State, while the southern portion of the island was free from British rule. The north was not. And so it was that in 1921, Ireland was partitioned and would not reunify until 1998. And so it was that after the partition of Ireland, Northern Ireland was left as a province of the United Kingdom, while the Free State was established in the south with its own parliament in Dublin, and it didn't take long for problems to arise. Since the partition of Ireland, the north had been governed by unionist parties who were accused of discrimination against the Catholic or nationalist minority. Meanwhile, in the south, the IRA continued to attack British targets despite the establishment of the Free State. The IRA claimed that the Free State was a British puppet regime and refused to accept the legitimacy of the new state. So it was that the IRA continued their fight against the British in the north, while fighting against fellow Irishmen in the south. It was during this period that the term the Troubles was coined to describe the ongoing conflict in Ireland. Finally, after 7 years in 1928, the IRA called a truce and began to demobilize. The IRA did not engage in further military activity until 1939, when the Second World War broke out. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war. Soon afterward, the British government passed the Emergency Powers Act, which suspended civil liberties in order to fight the war. Catholics in Northern Ireland felt that they were being unfairly targeted by the authorities and began to protest. They were also angry over the internment without trial of suspected IRA members. In response to these events, the IRA launched the Border Campaign in 1956 with the aim of destabilizing Northern Ireland and forcing the British to withdraw. Although the campaign failed, it marked a resurgence of support for the IRA. From 1940 to 1968, there was relative calm in Ireland, but underlying tensions between Catholics and Protestants remained. The Catholics felt that they were being discriminated against in housing, employment, and the right to vote. By the 1960s, Northern Ireland was becoming increasingly unstable. Throughout the world, there was a growing civil rights movement, and in the United States, the struggle for civil rights inspired many Catholics in Northern Ireland to demand equal rights for themselves. And so it was that in 1968 and 1969, Northern Ireland erupted in protest. Catholics began to demonstrate for voting rights and against discrimination, but the protests were met with a violent backlash. The worst violence occurred in Derry in 1968 and 1969, where serious rioting broke out between Catholics and Protestants. The British government decided to deploy the British Army to Northern Ireland to restore order. At first, the army was welcomed by some Catholics as liberators, but soon became a target as well. Many Catholics felt that the army was biased against them and that the soldiers were heavy-handed in their tactics. In 1972, British paratroopers opened fire on unarmed civil rights protesters in Derry, killing 14 people. The event became known as Bloody Sunday and outraged many nationalists. It is estimated that around 2,000 people attended the funeral of those killed, making it the largest ever in Northern Ireland at the time. Thousands of people joined the IRA in the wake of Bloody Sunday, and it seemed likely that the violence would continue and perhaps even escalate. So it was that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the IRA grew rapidly in strength. There were now 3 Republican paramilitary organizations committed to ending British rule in Northern Ireland. These were the original IRA, the official IRA, or OIRA, and the INLA. The INLA was formed in 1969 by members of the OIRA who wished to pursue a more overtly socialist agenda. The main difference between the OIRA and the PIRA was the OIRA's commitment to a socialist agenda and its willingness to form a political party. The OIRA also rejected the PIRA's strategy of armed struggle against the British. As for the British, they had the Royal Ulster Constabulary, or RUC, a police force tasked with maintaining law and order in Northern Ireland. The RUC was accused of heavy-handed tactics and of using excessive force against protesters. In response to the violence, the British government deployed the army to Northern Ireland. But the army was also accused of heavy-handed tactics and of using excessive force against protesters. By the mid-1970s, the situation in Northern Ireland had become increasingly polarized. There was growing support for both the IRA and loyalist paramilitaries, and violence was commonplace. In addition to the IRA, there were also a number of loyalist paramilitary groups, the most powerful of which was the Ulster Defence Association, or UDA. Other loyalist groups included the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, and the Red Hand Commando. Loyalist paramilitaries targeted Catholics and anyone they suspected of supporting the IRA. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, there was a series of bombings, assassinations, and sectarian killings. The IRA carried out a number of high-profile bombings in England and mainland Europe, targeting locations associated with the British government or the British way of life. One of the worst attacks was the 1984 Manchester bombing, which killed 5 people. In Northern Ireland itself, the IRA and other paramilitary groups carried out a number of assassinations, targeting both British soldiers and members of the security forces as well as politicians and community leaders. For their part, the British intelligence and police forces engaged in their own covert operations against the IRA. In 1976, for example, the RUC and British intelligence agents carried out shoot-to-kill operations against IRA suspects, which resulted in the deaths of several people. Shoot to kill was controversial and was the subject of numerous inquiries. It was claimed that the policy was designed to prevent IRA prisoners from being returned to active service after being wounded or captured, but it also appeared to be an attempt to discredit the IRA by portraying its members as violent and dangerous. Despite the violence, a number of attempts were made to end the conflict. In 1973, for example, the Sunningdale Agreement was signed, which established a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland. The agreement collapsed, however, when Unionists withdrew from the power-sharing executive in 1974. In 1985, the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed, which gave the Irish government a consultative role in Northern Irish affairs. The agreement was controversial and was seen as a betrayal by many Unionists, but it did lead to the release of a number of IRA prisoners. The late 1980s and early 1990s saw a number of ceasefires, which created an opportunity for peace talks. In 1994, the IRA declared a ceasefire, which lasted until 1996. A second ceasefire was declared in 1998 and lasted until 2005. The IRA claimed that the ceasefires were in the interests of peace, but it was clear that they were also designed to put pressure on the British government to end the conflict. It was against this backdrop that the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998. The agreement established a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland and provided for the disarmament of paramilitary groups. The agreement was a landmark achievement, and it is widely seen as having ended the worst of the violence in Northern Ireland. The process of decommissioning weapons was slow and difficult, but by 2005, most paramilitary groups had agreed to disarm. In the years since the Good Friday Agreement, Sinn has become one of the most successful political parties in Northern Ireland. This has caused some unease among Unionists who fear that Sinn will use its power to end the union with Great Britain. However, Sinn has stated that it has no plans to do so, and that it is committed to the Good Friday Agreement. Nonetheless, relations between nationalists and Unionists remain tense and there is still a risk of violence. In recent years, there have been a number of attacks by dissident Republican groups, such as the Real IRA, which are opposed to the peace process. All right, everyone, that's gonna do it for our look at the Irish Troubles from 1900 to 2000. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like, rating, comment below to let me know what you thought. And if you want to watch more videos like these, then consider subscribing. I'll see you guys next time. Edited and reviewed by Dr. Stephen F. Myler, PhD.